On the morning of Saturday, September 19, 1981, a 17-year-old boy named Tate Shaw walked into the Mercer County farm equipment auction in Celina, Ohio, with $215 in his pocket and one number burning a hole through the center of his chest. The number was 4,200. That was the figure written in blue ink at the bottom of the last letter Meridian Bank had sent his father. And that was the figure the bank would collect on March 15th of the following year. And that was the figure that stood between the Shaw family and the last 40 acres of ground they still owned free and clear. Tate had counted the days that morning before the sun came up. 178. He had 178 days to turn $215 into 4,200, and he was the only person in his family who understood the math. And he was the only person in that auction yard who knew he was running out of time. Nobody looked at him twice when he walked through the gate. He was the kind of boy that adults tend to overlook on instinct. Slender, quiet in the shoulders, a sunburned neck from 2 summers of detasseling corn for the pioneer crew out of Rockford. His father's old canvas work jacket 2 sizes too large, the cuffs rolled once at the wrists. Boots with the right heel worn crooked from a farm kid's habit of standing with his weight on one leg. He carried a spiral notebook, the cheap kind from the drugstore, with the wire starting to pull loose at the top. In his jacket pocket, he carried a compression gauge that had belonged to his grandfather and a small pocket mirror that belonged to his mother and a stub of pencil he had sharpened with a paring knife at the kitchen table the night before. He had registered as a bidder at 7 o'clock in the morning, which was an hour and a half before the yard began to fill. The woman at the registration table had looked at him over her glasses, the way adults look at children who show up in places they don't belong, and she had asked him whether his father knew where he was. Tate had said yes without explaining. It was true as far as it went. His father knew Tate was driving to Celina. His father did not know why. By 11 o'clock, there were 41 registered bidders in that yard. Retired farmers in freshly pressed shirts that meant this was a social day as much as a business one. Active operators with their checkbooks in their breast pockets and their trailers backed up against the side fence. 3 equipment dealers with clipboards and the particular impatience of men who were there to work. A land speculator from Toledo named Lester Mundy, who attended every county sale within 50 miles, a heavy man in his 50s, with a briefcase he never set down on the ground, and a habit of watching the crowd more carefully than he watched the equipment, and Duane Pritchard, who ran the largest farm equipment dealership between Celina and Fort Wayne, and who had been buying and selling tractors in western Ohio for 20 years, and who had passed Tate Shaw once in the aisle that morning, without registering that the boy existed. Tate had been counting on that. Let me tell you what Tate Shaw was doing in that auction yard. Because a boy his age does not walk into a room of 41 men with the kind of calm Tate was carrying unless he has prepared for it longer than anyone in the room could guess. He had been preparing for 9 months. He had been preparing since the evening in January when he had sat at his grandfather's kitchen table in Wert County and listened to Warren Shaw tell him in that slow, measured voice of a man who had spent 40 years on a tractor and another 6 watching the world change around him, that there were 2 kinds of farmers in the Midwest that year: the ones who still owned their equipment and the ones who did not, and that the difference between them by the spring of 1982 was going to look like the difference between a man standing on solid ground and a man standing on air. Warren had said that with no particular emphasis. The way a man says something he has known for a long time and does not expect anyone to argue with. And Tate, who was 16 years old at the time and had just spent 2 years watching his family lose ground he could not replace, had understood it the way you understand a diagnosis. You stop arguing. You start preparing. But we'll come back to Warren. This is not his story. His story was already written in 40 years of rows plowed and service manuals kept in the spare bedroom and lessons given without fanfare to a grandson who was listening more carefully than anyone knew. This is Tate's story. And Tate was standing in the preview yard at 7 o'clock that September morning, in the gray light before the sun cleared the barn roof with a flashlight in one hand and a notebook in the other. And he had one machine he had come to see. Lot 11. A 1963 Minneapolis Moline G705 diesel tractor, 96 horsepower. Row crop. Faded prairie gold paint chalked down to the primer in places. A front-end loader attached to the frame, the loader rusted almost solid at the pivot points. One headlight missing. The hood propped open because the auction handlers had wanted buyers to see the engine. And the engine? To anyone who did not know better, looked like the engine of a tractor that had been worked hard and then put out to die. Tate Shaw had been studying that exact tractor from 200 miles of distance for 8 months. He had not driven to Celina that morning to hope. He had driven to Celina that morning to execute. Here is what no one else in that yard knew yet. Tate Shaw had walked this same kind of auction 3 times in the previous year. He had walked the Adelaide County sale in March of 1980. He had walked the Putnam County sale in July of 1980. He had walked a small estate auction outside Coldwater in November of 1980. He had gone to every one of them for the same reason, and it was not to buy anything. He had gone to study one man, Duane Pritchard, the dealer from Celina, the man who bought more older equipment than anyone else in Western Ohio, and who had a rule about older equipment that Tate had watched him enforce 4 separate times, without a single exception. The rule was 5 minutes. Duane Pritchard gave every piece of older equipment exactly 5 minutes of his attention at preview, and no more. If the machine did not sell itself in 5 minutes, he walked away and made his buying decision on the next lot. Tate had timed him. 4 machines, 4 decisions, 4 times under 5 minutes. Duane Pritchard did not trust himself to study an old machine longer than that, because he believed that anything worth his attention would reveal itself quickly, and anything that required longer study was a trap. That was the rule, and Tate had planned his entire strategy around the fact that the G705 would look in the first 5 minutes of a man's attention exactly like the kind of machine Duane Pritchard would walk away from. He had planned his entire strategy around the fact that he, Shaw, was the only person in Mercer County who was going to look at the G705 for more than 5 minutes. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone in your life make a decision too fast? Watched them glance at something, form a judgment, and walk away, when you could see with your own eyes that if they had stayed for 10 more minutes or 20, the whole shape of their day would have turned out differently? Most of us have. Most of us have been the one glancing, and most of us have been the one watching. And the quiet lesson that sits underneath it, the one that takes a long time to learn, is that the world does not reward speed of judgment. It rewards patience. And patience on the right morning in the right yard is worth more than money, because it is the one thing no amount of money can buy after the fact. Tate Shaw understood that at 17, because his family had learned it the hard way 5 years earlier, and they had lost 80 acres of the best ground in the township teaching him. The Shaw farm sat 4 miles north of Rockford, on the west side of the county, 160 acres of corn and soybean ground, bordered on the north by a creek that ran most of the year, and on the east by a gravel road that had been there since the Civil War. Tate's father, Merle Shaw, had farmed it alone since his own father, Warren, retired in 1975. Merle was a steady man, not quick with words, not quick with anything. He was 46 years old that fall, a man with the kind of weathered jaw that comes from a lifetime of wind off the open fields, and the kind of permanent exhaustion in his eyes that comes from knowing too much about how thin the margins are between a farm that survives and a farm that doesn't. He had not always looked that way. In 1976, when Tate was 12 years old, Merle Shaw had driven home from the Celina John Deere dealership with a brand new 4,440 tractor hitched to a flatbed borrowed from a neighbor, and he had driven it down their gravel road with the kind of pride that Tate had never seen on his father's face before and never saw on it again afterward. The tractor had cost $32,000. Merle had borrowed it at 14% interest, which was the going rate in the spring of '76, and he had signed the papers at the Meridian Bank in Celina with the same hand he used to sign his Christmas cards. The loan was supposed to pay itself off over 7 years from the added productivity of the new tractor. That was the math the dealer had done. That was the math the loan officer had done. That was the math Merle Shaw had done, sitting at the kitchen table the week before he drove to town with a pencil and a legal pad, and the kind of careful hope of a man who was trying to believe that the world was going to continue running the way it had always run. The world did not continue running the way it had always run. In 1979, Paul Volcker took over the Federal Reserve and began raising interest rates to break the back of American inflation. Merle's loan was a variable rate loan with a reset clause most farmers in the Midwest had signed without reading carefully in '76 because nobody had thought rates would move much. By the fall of '79, the rate on Merle's tractor loan had reset from 14% to 18%. By the spring of '80, it was going higher. By December of 1980, the prime rate hit 21.5%, the highest it had ever been in American history. And Merle Shaw sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands and told his wife Adelaide that he could not make the payment anymore. Not that month, not the next, not the one after that. In August of 1979, Meridian Bank foreclosed on the east 80 acres of the Shaw farm. The best ground they had, the bottomland along the creek where the soil ran black and deep. They took it to cover the tractor loan and the operating line of credit together. And when they were finished taking it, Merle Shaw had 160 acres left. A tractor he still owed $20,000 on, and a promise from the bank that they would be back in the spring of 1982 for the final balloon payment on the remaining note, $4,200. That was the number. Tate was 15 years old the night Meridian came for the 80, He remembered it the way you remember the night the house burned down next door. Which is to say, he remembered it in fragments and sounds, in the particular way his mother's face looked when she sat at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, with the bank's letter in her hands, and did not cry, but also did not move for almost an hour. He remembered his father going out to the barn after midnight. He remembered following him an hour later, not to talk, just to be there, because he did not know what else to do. He remembered standing in the doorway of the equipment shed and hearing the sound his father was making, and realizing after a long moment that the sound was his father crying, standing with his hand on the fender of the John Deere 4,440 that had cost them their farm, and crying in the dark the way a man cries when he does not know anyone can hear him. Tate had never told anyone he had heard it. Not his mother, not his grandfather, not a single living soul. He had gone back to the house and gone to bed, and lain in the dark until morning. And somewhere in that dark, he had made a decision, though he had not known it was a decision at the time. He had decided that he was going to learn how to keep this from ever happening again. To his father, to his mother, to his own family someday if he ever had one. And since he was 15 years old and had no money, and no equipment, and no prospects, the only thing he had to work with was the same thing his grandfather had spent 40 years assembling in a spare bedroom in Wert County. Knowledge. He had started going to his grandfather's house every Saturday after that night. Not every other Saturday, the way he had before. Every Saturday. And Warren Shaw, who had seen something change in his grandson and had not asked what it was, had simply opened the door to the room he kept on the east side of the house, the room with the 3 walls of manuals and the filing cabinets and the service digests going back to the 1940s. And he had said, without ceremony, "What do you want to start with?" Tate had started with tractors. It had taken him 14 months to read his way through the John Deere bulletins alone. He had read the International Harvester digests after that. He had read Minneapolis Moline, which was a smaller collection because the company had been absorbed by White Farm Equipment in 1969, and most dealers no longer carried the service documentation. Warren had told him to pay particular attention to the catalog. Tate had asked why. Warren had said, because a machine everyone else has forgotten how to service is a machine you can buy for parts prices and run for 20 years. And because nobody else in a 5-county radius is going to know what you know about them. And because someday, Warren had said, and this was the only time in all those Saturdays that Warren's voice had carried any edge to it, someday you are going to be in a room where knowing something that room doesn't know is going to matter more than any amount of money you could bring into it. Prepare for that day. It comes to every man who works at his craft long enough. And when it comes, you want to be ready. Tate had prepared. He had prepared for 9 months after that January conversation. He had read every Minneapolis Moline bulletin in Warren's collection twice. He had written away through the interlibrary loan program at the Wert County Library for 7 additional service documents that Warren did not have, and the documents had taken 3 weeks to arrive, and he had read them the evening they came in. He had built over those 9 months a file on the Minneapolis Moline G705 tractor that was, as far as he knew, more complete than any file that existed in the state of Ohio outside of Warren's house. And when the auction catalog for the Mercer County September sale had arrived in the Shaw's mailbox 3 weeks before the sale, and Tate had opened it at the kitchen table and turned to lot 11 and seen the listing for a 1963 Minneapolis Moline 705 diesel row crop with a front loader attachment sold as is condition, as seen from the estate of Orville Bascomb. Wert County estimated value $800 to $1,400. He had felt something settle into place inside his chest, the way a plow drops into soil when the lift cable lets go. He had not shown the catalog to his father. He had not shown it to his mother. He had driven to Wert County that weekend, and he had sat across from his grandfather at the kitchen table, and he had slid the catalog across the oilcloth, and he had pointed at lot 11, and he had said that one. Warren had looked at it for a long time without speaking. He had looked at the name Orville Bascomb, and something had moved across his face that Tate had not understood at the time, and Warren had not explained. Warren had simply said, "Tell me what you know," and Tate had told him. He had told him about the 3 known weaknesses of the G705. The injector pump calibration that drifted in machines past 1,500 hours without the specific Minneapolis Moline service. The front axle pivot bearing that wore faster than its replacement schedule. The hydraulic return line fitting that had been revised in a silent factory correction in '65, which meant any G705 built before that year was running with an undersized fitting on the right side of the main valve block that could fail under sustained pressure. He had told his grandfather that a G705 with all 3 of those service issues addressed with clean records and documented maintenance was a $1,500 tractor that could run another 2,000 hours. And that a G705 without those services was worth exactly what the parts dealers would pay for its engine and transmission on a breakdown basis, which in the Celina market in September of '81 was about $600. Warren had nodded. Then he had said the difference between those 2 machines, Tate, is 40 minutes of careful looking. That's all. And every other man in that yard on that Saturday is going to give it 5. He had paused then and added one more thing. I knew Orville Bascomb, Warren had said. That was all he had said. He had not explained. And Tate, who had learned when to ask and when not to, had not pressed him. Now Tate was standing in the preview yard at 7:15 in the morning on the Saturday of the auction, and he was unscrewing the breather cap on the G705's engine, and he was checking the oil with a borrowed flashlight, and he was smelling the oil and holding it up to the light and making a note in his spiral notebook. Clean, recent change. Not more than 50 hours on the current oil. He had not expected that. He had expected oil that looked like coffee gone to mud. He pulled the transmission dipstick, checked the fluid. Clean as well. Recent. He crouched down by the front axle, got his flashlight on the pivot, looked for the wear pattern he had studied in 3 different Minneapolis Moline service bulletins. He could not see it. The pivot looked recent, possibly replaced within the last year, maybe 2. He stood up slowly and felt something shift in the way his chest was sitting. He walked to the right side of the main hydraulic valve block. He knelt on the cold gravel. He put his flashlight beam on the return line fitting he had been reading about for 8 months, and he saw very clearly in the chalky gray light of the morning that the fitting was the revised fitting. The factory part number cast into the brass still faintly visible. Post 1965. Someone had installed the corrected part on a 1963 machine, which meant someone knew. He stayed crouched there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he stood up and walked around to the back of the tractor and stood at the operator's platform. The seat was original, cracked vinyl sagging at the springs. The footrests were worn smooth from 40 years of boots. He looked at the seat for a moment, and then he reached around behind it, sliding his hand down along the back rest into the space between the seat pan and the fender, because Warren had told him in the 3rd month of his studies, you always check behind the seat, because farmers who kept good records kept them where they could reach them while the tractor was idling. His fingers closed on a plastic sleeve. He pulled it out slowly. It was a gallon freezer bag. Heavy plastic, folded twice, and taped at the seam with brittle silver electrical tape that had yellowed at the edges. Inside the bag was a stack of papers, perhaps 1.5 inches thick, and through the cloudy plastic, Tate could see ruled notebook pages filled with the careful blue ink handwriting of a man who had kept records for a long time. He did not open it there in the yard. He tucked it under his jacket close to his ribs inside the shirt. He stood up and walked back around to the hood of the tractor and picked up his compression gauge and went to work on the cylinders. And he did not let his face show anything at all, because 2 men had been watching him from the far side of the yard for the last 20 minutes, and he did not want either of them to know what he had found. The 2 men were Duane Pritchard and Lester Mundy. Duane had arrived at 7:35 minutes after Tate and had made his rounds with a clipboard and a pencil, and the same efficient stride Tate had watched him use at 3 other auctions. He had stopped at lot 11. He had looked at the machine for exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds by the clock on the feed store across the road. He had walked around it once. He had looked inside the engine compartment. He had made 2 check marks on his clipboard. He had turned to his associate, a young man in a ball cap, and had said one word: parts. Then he had moved on. Tate had seen all of it. He had seen Duane walk away. He had felt for a quarter of a second the small, quiet satisfaction of a man watching a prediction come true. And then he had noticed Lester Mundy. Lester Mundy was still standing at lot 11 when Tate came back around the side of the tractor after installing the compression gauge on the number 1 cylinder. Lester was holding his briefcase against his leg and looking at the G705 with the particular stillness of a man who was not counting his 5 minutes. Lester had been at the tractor for at least 20 minutes already. Tate had been aware of him in the periphery of his attention the whole time, the way you are aware of a hawk on a fence post while you work in a field. Not close enough to worry about. But there, Lester caught Tate's eye for 1/2 of 1 second and smiled very slightly and walked away. Tate did not move for several seconds after Lester was gone because he had planned for Duane Pritchard. He had planned for 9 months. He had studied the man's habits timed. His decisions understood exactly how Duane would process this machine and walk away from it, and he had come to this auction because he knew Duane would walk away from it. Duane was the predictable piece of the equation. Lester Mundy was not. Tate did not know Lester. He had seen him at one other sale in Putnam County, standing at the edge of the crowd with the same briefcase, saying nothing, buying nothing. He had made a note in his file at the time. Unknown. Speculator. Watches more than bids. He had not thought more about it. Now he was thinking about it. And what he was thinking was that a man who stands at a tractor for 20 minutes at a preview is a man who is looking for something specific. And what he was thinking was that there was only one specific thing to find at lot 11 that morning. And it was the thing he had just pulled out from behind the seat and tucked against his ribs. Which meant Lester Mundy might already know. Which meant Lester Mundy might have already looked. Which meant the one advantage Tate Shaw had walked into the Mercer County auction yard, carrying the 9 months of study, the 40 minutes of careful work. The plastic sleeve of records against his ribs might not be an advantage that belonged to him alone. He finished the compression test on the first cylinder. The reading was 140 pounds, which was within factory specification for a G705 with 4,000 plus hours. He moved to the second cylinder, 138. Third, 141. Fourth, 137. Fifth, 140. Sixth, 139. Every cylinder within 3 pounds of factory spec. The engine was not tired. The engine had been maintained by someone who had known exactly what he was doing and had done it for years. He packed the compression gauge back into his jacket pocket. He stood up slowly. He looked across the yard at the clock on the feed store. 8 o'clock. The auction would start at 9:30. He had 1 hour and 30 minutes. He walked out of the preview yard and around to the gravel parking lot behind the feed store, where his father's old pickup was parked under a hackberry tree, and he sat in the driver's seat with the door open and the morning air cool on his face, and he pulled the freezer bag out from under his jacket and laid it on the bench seat beside him, and he unfolded the tape carefully, the way you would open a letter from someone who had died. The first page was a title sheet, handwritten in blue ink. The handwriting was sharp, slightly slanted. The kind of penmanship you learned in a one-room school in the 1920s and never lost. Minneapolis Moline G705 diesel. Serial number blank blank blank. Owner Orville Bascomb, Van Wert County, Ohio. Service record begun March 11th, 1970. Tate turned the page. The entries went on for nearly 50 pages. Every oil change, every filter, every belt, every bearing, every service dated with part numbers and hours, and occasional annotations in the margin about weather or field conditions, or the behavior of the machine under load. Tate read through the first 10 pages with a steady rising feeling in his chest that he could not immediately name, and then he recognized it. And what he recognized was not triumph and not vindication. What he recognized was the feeling of standing next to a man who had done something the right way for a long time, without anyone watching him do it. He turned to the last page. The final entry was dated March 22nd, 1980. Oil and filter change. 212 hours before the recorded total of 4,300. And below the final entry in a slightly different hand. Slower, heavier on the pen, the handwriting of a man who knew he was writing it for the last time. Orville Bascomb had written a note. Tate read the note twice. Then he read it a third time. Then he sat very still in the cab of his father's pickup for almost 4 minutes, looking out the dusty windshield at the September morning. Because what Orville Bascomb had written on the last page of the service record of his Minneapolis Moline G705 tractor was not a note about the machine at all. It was a message. and the message was for a specific person. And the name of that specific person was written at the top of the note in the same careful blue ink as the rest of the 40 pages behind it. Tate closed the freezer bag. He tucked it back inside his jacket against his ribs. He sat for another minute in the cab of the pickup, and then he reached for the payphone number he had written inside the cover of his spiral notebook at 4 o'clock that morning when he couldn't sleep. And he climbed out of the truck and walked across the gravel lot to the payphone, bolted to the side of the feed store. And he dropped a dime into the slot and dialed a long-distance number he knew by heart. And he waited while it rang 4 times in a farmhouse in Wert County, 60 miles away. His grandfather picked up on the 5th ring. Grandpa Tate said, "I need you to tell me again about Orville Bascomb." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long pause. Long enough that Tate had time to hear a tractor starting up somewhere across the road, and a screen door slamming behind the feed store, and the dry rattle of a maple leaf scraping across the gravel at his feet. Long enough that he wondered for 1 second whether his grandfather had heard him at all. Then Warren Shaw, 72 years old, sitting at his kitchen table, 60 miles away with a cup of coffee, and the morning paper folded beside him, cleared his throat once and said very quietly, "What did you find, Tate?" And Tate Shaw, 17 years old, standing in a gravel parking lot in Celina, Ohio, on the morning that was going to decide everything, opened his mouth to answer. Tate held the receiver tight against his ear and looked out across the gravel lot at the back of the feed store, at the faded red paint on the wooden siding, and the stack of empty pallets by the loading dock, and he tried to find the right words for what he had just read. There were not any right words, so he read it out loud instead. He read the note Orville Bascomb had written on the last page of the service record, in the slow, heavy handwriting of a man who had known he was writing it for the last time. He read it straight through without pausing, without commentary, the way you read a telegram. And when he was finished, he stood very still, with the receiver pressed against his ear, and he waited. His grandfather did not answer for a long time. Tate could hear the small, ambient sounds of a kitchen 60 miles away. The tick of the wall clock above the stove, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rasp of his grandfather's breath, slower than it used to be, because Warren Shaw was 72 years old that fall, and had slowed down some in the last 2 winters, in ways that he did not talk about. Tate listened to those sounds and did not press him. Warren finally spoke. Orville Bascomb, Warren said, was the best tractor mechanic between Toledo and Fort Wayne for about 20 years. "I taught him how to read a service manual," Warren said. That was in 1958. He was 23 years old. He had come up from Kentucky to work for the International Harvester dealer in Van Wert, and he had the hands for it, but he did not have the reading for it. The manuals were written at a level most boys his age had not been taught to manage. I sat with him in his shop 3 evenings a week for about 4 months, and I worked him through the first couple of catalogs line by line. After that, he did not need me. He was past me in 2 years. By 64, he could service anything that ran on a diesel engine in the state of Ohio, and he knew it, and he did not charge enough, which was his only real weakness as a working man. Warren paused, and Tate could hear him swallow. "He came to see me once in 1978, Warren said. "He drove up to the house on a Thursday afternoon in June. I remember because your grandmother was still alive, and she fixed lunch for the 3 of us. It was the last time Orville and I ate a meal together at that table. Warren paused again. Your father had just taken the second operating loan from Meridian Bank, Warren said. The one that put the East 80 under the loan as collateral. Orville had heard about it from one of the clerks over at the feed store in Rockford. He drove up to Van Wert to ask me whether Merle was going to be all right. I told him what I thought. I told him your father had bought a tractor he did not need with money he did not have, and that the rate was going to move against him, and that he was walking into the same mistake every third farmer in the county was walking into that year. Orville asked me if I had told your father so. I said I had. Orville asked me if your father had listened. I said he had not. Orville sat at that table a long time, Warren said. And then he told me he was going to drive over and talk to Merle himself. Not as my friend. As a man who had serviced more John Deeres than anyone in 3 counties, and had seen what the new models were going to do to a small operator running 160 acres. He drove over the next week. He sat in your kitchen with your father and your mother for about 2 hours. I was not there. Your mother told me later that Orville talked your father through the math on a legal pad. He told your father that if he did not restructure the loan that summer, with whatever tool he had to use to do it, he was going to lose the East 80 inside 3 years. Your father did not restructure, Warren said. Your father believed the rate would hold. Orville drove home. He did not come to see me about it again. It was not his place to come back a second time. He had said his piece. Warren paused for a long while after that. Then he said the East 80 was foreclosed on in August of 1979. 13 months after Orville had warned him. Orville never said a word to me about being right. Not once. He was not a man who took pleasure in being right. He died in June of this year, Warren said. I drove down to his funeral. His wife told me he had been sick for about 8 months. She said he had asked her toward the end to make sure the G705 went to the Mercer County sale instead of the Van Wert sale. He did not say why. She did not ask. Warren stopped. Tate stood in the gravel lot with the phone pressed against his ear and looked down at the worn toe of his boot and felt something complicated moving through his chest that he did not have a name for. He was not ready to name it. He was going to have to name it later, maybe on the drive home that night, maybe years from then, not standing in a gravel lot in Celina at 8:13 in the morning, on the day everything was going to be decided. The note Orville had written on the last page of the service record said this: "If whoever reads these records is a Shaw, and if he is the grandson of Warren Shaw, tell him his grandfather taught me everything I know about how to keep a machine running past the point where other men would quit. Tell him I never paid him back. Tell him I am paying him now. Tell him this tractor has 1,900 hours of life left in her if she is serviced according to the schedule in this book. Tell him she will earn a good man his ground back." Signed, Orville Bascomb. March 22nd, 1980. Warren's voice came back over the line. "Tate," he said. "Yes, sir." "You do what you came there to do," Warren said. "Do not think about any of this now. Think about it later. Right now you have one job." "You know what it is." "Yes, sir," Tate said. He hung up the phone. He stood for a moment in the gravel lot, with his hand still on the receiver, and the morning light starting to turn from gray to gold as the sun cleared the roof line of the feed store, and he closed his eyes for one full breath. And then he opened them, and walked back across the lot toward the auction yard, with the freezer bag tucked tight against his ribs, inside his jacket, and the spiral notebook in his left hand, and the $215 in the front pocket of his jeans. And if you had watched him walk, you would not have seen any change in him. You would have seen the same 17-year-old boy in the oversized work jacket walking toward the same auction yard he had walked into an hour earlier. But something had shifted, and it was not something that showed on a boy's face. It was something that had settled down under the face. It was the thing Warren Shaw had spent 9 months teaching him to carry without carrying visibly. Let me tell you about the 8 months that had brought Tate Shaw to that morning. Because the boy who walked back into that auction yard at 8:15 was not the boy who had started going to his grandfather's house on Saturdays after the night his father cried in the equipment shed. For 14 months after that August night in 1979, Tate had read his way through the John Deere and International Harvester bulletins in Warren's spare bedroom one Saturday at a time, without knowing yet what he was preparing for. By the spring of 1980, he had also started going to auctions. Not to buy, to watch. The first one had been in Adelaide County in March of 1980. He had driven down with Warren, who had stayed in the truck and let Tate walk the preview yard alone. The second had been in Putnam County in July of that year. He had gone alone. The third had been a small estate sale outside Coldwater in November of 1980. At every one of them, he had watched the same man. Duane Pritchard, the dealer from Celina. 4 machines examined 4 decisions made 4 times under 5 minutes. A man whose rules were wrong, but whose rules were reliable. And a man whose rules were reliable could be planned around. Tate had spent the first 2 weeks of December 1980 sitting at his desk working out on paper exactly what it would take for a 17-year-old boy with $200 in a savings account to buy a machine worth $1,500 at an auction where an experienced dealer would be bidding against him. The answer he had worked out by the 3rd week of December was that he could not do it directly. He did not have the money. The only way through the problem was leverage. Not price and leverage. The plan which Tate had written out in the back of his spiral notebook in pencil on December 28th of 1980 had 3 parts. Part 1. Identify a machine at an upcoming auction that matched the profile. Older, obscure, visually rough, with documented service weaknesses that only careful study could evaluate. Part 2. Study the machine's full service profile in advance. Know more about it than any adult in the yard. Part 3. Convert the information during the auction itself from private knowledge into public reality. Not by bidding. He would not bid. He would surface the information in a way that forced the room to reprice the machine in real time, and in doing so, he would make himself a person whose knowledge was worth paying for. That was the plan in December. In January of 1981, Warren had pulled down the Minneapolis Moline binder from the middle shelf of the second wall of the spare bedroom and had set it on the kitchen table and had told Tate to start reading. Tate had read it for 6 weeks every Saturday, 4 hours at a stretch. He had learned the injector pump timing sequence. He had learned the hydraulic pressure specification. He had learned the serial number cutoff at which the revised hydraulic fitting had been silently introduced in 1965. By March, he had filed his first interlibrary loan requests through the Wert County Public Library. The librarian had looked at the list of documents he had written out and had raised her eyebrows at him over the counter. Most 17-year-olds do not request factory service bulletins. She had said. Tate had said, yes, ma'am, he knew that. She had helped him anyway. 3 of the documents had come back from the Ohio State University Agricultural Engineering Library. 2 had come from a private collector in Michigan who had heard about the request and had shipped copies at his own expense with a note that said, "Any young man your age reading this material deserves encouragement." 1 had come from the Minneapolis Moline Historical Society, a small organization run out of a farmhouse in Minnesota by 2 retired engineers who had worked on the G series in the 60s. 1 had never come at all. By May of 1981, Tate had a file on the G705 that filled 3 manila folders and took up most of a desk drawer in his bedroom. Then came the summer. In July of 1981, the catalog for the Mercer County September sale had not yet been printed, and Tate had driven alone to a 4th auction in Putnam County to keep watching Duane and to look for the candidate machine his plan required. He had found nothing. He had spent 5 hours in the preview yard, made 40 pages of notes, and come home at 9 o'clock that night with an empty feeling in his chest. He had not expected. 3 other dealers had noticed him that day. One of them had told him not unkindly, but not kindly, either that preview yards were not places for unaccompanied minors, and that he should go home. Tate had gone home. He had sat in his father's old pickup in the gravel driveway of their farm at 11 o'clock that night, with the engine off, and the headlights off, and the spiral notebook open on his lap. And he had looked at the 6 months of notes in his own handwriting, the careful diagrams, the column of part numbers, the cross references, and he had felt for the first time since the December night he had written the plan the full weight of what he was trying to do. He was 17 years old. He had $200. He had been turned away from an auction yard that afternoon by a dealer twice his age, and he had 183 days until the balloon payment came due. He had sat in the pickup for almost 2 hours. He had not torn the notebook up. He had thought about it. He had rehearsed in his head what it would feel like to rip the 6 months of pencil writing out page by page and throw them into the drainage ditch behind the barn and walk back into the house and go to bed and stop. But he had not done it. He had just sat there with the notebook on his lap and the weight on his chest and the windows of his father's truck fogged over with his own breath. His mother had found him at 12:45 in the morning. Adelaide Shaw had not come out to the pickup to ask him what was wrong. She had come out because she had woken up and seen the pickup still parked in the driveway and had understood the way mothers understand these things, that her son was sitting out there in the dark, not because he was waiting for something, but because he did not know where else to sit. She had put on her housecoat and her boots, and she had walked across the yard to the driver's side of the pickup, and she had not opened the door. She had knocked on the window once. Tate had rolled it down. She had held out a coffee cup to him. He had taken it. She had stood there with her arms folded against the July night and looked at her son, who was not looking at her, who was looking at the dashboard of the pickup, and she had said exactly one sentence. "Your father lost the east 80 acres because he believed a salesman," she said. "You are trying to save the last 40 because you believe yourself. Do not stop believing yourself tonight." Then she had turned and walked back across the yard to the house. She had not looked back. Tate had sat in the pickup for another 10 minutes. He had drunk the coffee. He had closed the notebook. He had put the notebook inside his jacket against his ribs, the same way he would carry the freezer bag against his ribs. 2 months later, and he had gotten out of the truck and walked into the house and gone to bed. He had gone back to the library the next morning at 9 o'clock when it opened, and he had filed 3 more interlibrary loan requests, and he had kept going. Have you ever had somebody who loves you say one sentence to you in the middle of a bad night that you carry with you for the rest of your working life? Most of us have, and if we are lucky, the sentence is short, and it is true, and it is said by someone who is not trying to fix us, but who has decided to stand next to us while we fix ourselves. That was what Adelaide Shaw did in the driveway of a farm 4 miles north of Rockford, Ohio, at 12:45 in the morning on a Wednesday in July of 1981. She did not tell her son how to save the farm. She did not ask him what his plan was. She did not offer him help. She did not have. She handed him a cup of coffee, and she said one sentence, and she went back to bed. And that sentence was the difference between a 17-year-old boy who tore his notebook up in a July driveway and a 17-year-old boy who walked into the Mercer County auction yard 2 months later with the notebook intact and the weight still in his chest and the plan still on the last page in pencil. The auction catalog for the Mercer County September sale had arrived in the Shaw's mailbox 3 weeks after that July night. Tate had opened it at the kitchen table and turned to lot 11. He had felt something settle into place inside his chest, the way a plow drops into soil when the lift cable lets go. He had not told anyone about the plan. Not his mother. Not his father. Not even Warren. Warren had known about the study. Warren had not known what Tate intended to do with it. There is a particular loneliness in that kind of preparation, and a 17-year-old boy had been carrying it for 9 months, sitting across from his father at dinner, every night watching his father try not to look at the calendar above the stove, where someone had circled March 15th, 1982 in black marker. He had not told them. He was going to tell them that night. He walked back into the preview yard at 8:15 in the morning with the freezer bag tucked against his ribs and the plan of 9 months running through his head one more time, step by step, the way a pilot runs through a pre-flight check. And he positioned himself at the edge of the yard near the water trough, where he could see both the G705 on the far side of the yard and the fence line by the gate, where Lester Mundy was standing alone beside his briefcase, watching the crowd. Lester Mundy was wearing a gray sport coat that fit him badly across the shoulders, and a white dress shirt buttoned to the collar with no tie, and brown slacks, and the kind of dress shoes that did not belong in a gravel auction yard. He was a man out of his place, but he did not hold himself like a man out of his place. He held himself like a man who had come to this yard to do one specific thing and did not much care what anyone else in the yard thought of him. He was not talking to anyone. He was not looking at any equipment. He was standing still. He was waiting. Tate watched him for almost 3 full minutes. Lester never looked at the G705. Not once. Not even a glance. And this was Tate understood the confirmation of what he had feared the first time Lester had looked at him and smiled that small, quiet smile by the side of the tractor an hour earlier. Lester Mundy was not examining the machine anymore. Lester Mundy was past examining the machine. Lester Mundy had already examined the machine and had already made his decision. And the only thing left for Lester to do now was wait for the bidding to open at $600 and walk out of the yard with a tractor that was going to earn him 4 times its purchase price inside 6 months. He had read the records. He had put them back behind the seat. He had let Tate find them the second time, because finding them the second time did not matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was who held the paddle when the gavel came down. And Lester Mundy had a paddle in his inside jacket pocket. Tate could see the top edge of the bidder card sticking up out of the breast pocket number 23. Tate stood by the water trough and did the arithmetic. He had planned for Duane Pritchard, who worked on 5-minute decisions. Duane was going to walk away. Duane had already walked away. Good. The plan was working on that axis. He had planned for the crowd, which would follow Virgil Ames, the parts dealer from Lima, up to about $600, because that was the parts dealer's ceiling, and then would stop because nobody else in the yard had any information that would take them past 600. Good. The plan was working on that axis. He had not planned for a second informed bidder. He had not planned for Lester Mundy. Lester Mundy's presence meant that when Tate stood up in the middle of the bidding and read the records out loud and forced the room to reprice the machine, Lester would already be bidding against him. And Lester had, from the look of him, the kind of disciplined margin math that professional speculators carry in their heads like weather. He would not chase the tractor past the point where his return on capital crossed the line between speculation and labor. Where that line fell, Tate could not predict exactly. It depended on what Lester had paid to get here, what he believed the Toledo market ceiling was, and how much pride he was willing to leave on a gravel lot in Celina. What Tate could predict was that Lester was going to bid, and that every dollar Lester bid past the parts dealer's ceiling of $600 was going to be a dollar that Duane Pritchard, standing in his own home county auction yard, was going to have to match if he did not want an out-of-town speculator to walk a sleeper out from under him, which meant the final number was going to land somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000, and the exact landing point was going to depend on Lester's margin discipline and Duane's bruised pride. And the only thing Tate could do about any of it was surface the information at the right moment and let the 2 older men price the machine between them. That was part 3 of the plan. Working exactly as it was supposed to work, and the final number, wherever it landed, mattered to Tate in a way the rest of the room could not have guessed, because the plan had a 4th part that Tate had not written down anywhere, not even in the back of the spiral notebook. He had kept part 4 in his head. Part 4 was this: the dealer who won the auction, Duane Pritchard, was going to owe Tate Shaw something after the gavel came down. Not gratitude. Gratitude was cheap. The dealer was going to owe Tate a professional debt. Because the dealer was going to have paid more than he intended to pay for a machine he had already decided was parts, and the reason he had paid more was going to be the 17-year-old boy standing in his auction yard with a notebook. And a man like Duane Pritchard, when he owes a professional debt, pays it with work. He pays it with a job offer. He pays it with an hourly rate for preview services. And Tate, who had 178 days to find $4,200, was going to name the rate. That was part 4. Part 4 depended on Duane Pritchard paying more than he intended to pay. The bigger the gap between what Duane intended to pay and what Duane actually paid, the larger the professional debt, and the better the rate Tate could name. Tate stood at the water trough for another minute and let this settle through him. It was not a pleasant settling. There was a cost to it. Because if Part 4 was going to work the way the arithmetic said it could work, then Tate was going to stand in this yard in front of 41 men and use an old mechanic's handwritten note. A note written to Warren Shaw's grandson from the grave of a dying man in Wert County as a lever to move a dealer up a bidding war with a speculator in order to extract a professional rate out of the dealer afterward that would earn Tate $4,200 before March 15th. Orville Bascomb had not written the note to be used as a lever. Orville Bascomb had written the note to pay an old debt to Warren Shaw, and Tate was about to use it anyway because he had a farm to save, and because the only hands that would save it were his, and because sometimes a man has to use the gift his elders left him, not the way his elders imagined it would be used, but the way the world in front of him requires it to be used. And he has to do it without flinching. And he has to do it without apology. And he has to carry the small private knowledge afterward for the rest of his life that he took a man's last handwriting and turned it into working capital. He stood at the water trough and let himself feel the weight of it for one long breath. Then he set it down. He did not set it aside. You did not set a thing like that aside. You set it down in a place inside your chest where you could come back to it later at a kitchen table on a long drive home on a December morning 20 years from now, when you were looking at the same handwriting in the same freezer bag and remembering what you had used it for. You set it down in the place where you kept the permanent things. Then you did the work. Tate walked away from the water trough and found a spot along the fence line where he could see the auctioneers stand, and he checked the time on the feed store clock. 8:32. The sale would start at 9:30 with Lot 1. Lot 11 would come up somewhere between 11 o'clock and 11:30. He had about 3 hours. He opened his notebook to a clean page and began writing in small, careful pencil the exact sequence of what he was going to say when Hollis Thurston, the auctioneer, began counting down on Lot 11. He wrote it in the order he would speak it. He wrote the opening line first. He wrote the 3 service markers he would cite. He wrote the hour count and the service life remaining. He wrote the line about the hydraulic fitting revision with the post 65 part number. He wrote nothing about Orville Bascomb's note to Warren. That line he would not read out loud. That line belonged to the private inheritance, not the public one. He would let Duane Pritchard find it on his own when Duane pulled the records out of the freezer bag. He wrote the script through twice, and then he closed the notebook and sat down with his back against the fence post and waited. He watched the yard fill up. He watched the farmers collect in small standing groups by the coffee urn the auction company had set up on a folding table. He watched Duane Pritchard make his second circuit of the yard clipboard in hand, ball-capped associate, 2 steps behind him. He watched Lester Mundy buy a cup of coffee and drink it slowly, looking at nothing in particular, saying nothing to anyone. He watched the sun climb above the feed store roof and fall across the far side of the yard and light up the chalky prairie gold paint on the hood of the Minneapolis Moline G705. He watched Hollis Thurston climb the 3 steps to the auctioneer's stand at 9:28 in the morning and tap the microphone and clear his throat and call the Mercer County September equipment auction to order for the 16th year running. And Tate Shaw, 17 years old, son of Merle Shaw, and Adelaide Shaw of Rockford, Ohio, grandson of Warren Shaw of Wert County, sat with his back against the fence post and the freezer bag against his ribs and the notebook on his knee and the $215 in the front pocket of his jeans. And he waited for lot 11. Hollis Thurston was a short man with a white mustache and a brown felt hat, and the kind of easy microphone voice that had been calling sales in western Ohio since the summer of 1965. He opened the sale with the lot manifest and the terms of the auction and the reminder that all equipment was sold as is condition, as seen cash or certified funds at the end of the day. He worked through the first 10 lots in about 80 minutes. A small Ford tractor went to a dairy operator from Coldwater for $650. A field cultivator went to a young farmer from St. Mary's who paid $400. A hay rake went for $180. Tate watched from the fence line and did not move. He had written his script. He was not revising it. He was letting the morning run its course. Lot 11 came up at 11:22. Hollis walked over to the Minneapolis Moline G705 with his clipboard in his hand, and he stood at the front of the tractor, and he looked out at the crowd of 41 men who had gathered in a loose half circle around him, and he read from his sheet. 1963. Minneapolis Moline G705 diesel. Engine turns over. Condition as seen. Loader attachment included condition unknown. Service history not provided. Sold as is. Opening at $600. Nobody moved. Hollis was a professional. He did not pause. 500 then. Nothing. 400. Virgil Ames, the parts dealer from Lima, raised his paddle. 400, Hollis said. Do I have 450? A second bidder raised. A man Tate did not know. 450. 500, Virgil. 550, second bidder. 600, Virgil. Hollis counted it. 600 going once, Hollis said. Going twice. Tate raised his hand. He did not raise a bidder paddle because he did not have a bidder paddle. He raised his hand open, the way a student raises a hand in a classroom when he has something to say. The morning sun was behind him, and he was standing toward the back of the half circle of men, and it took Hollis Thurston about 2 seconds to spot the raised hand in his peripheral vision. Hollis stopped counting. Son, Hollis said, and the word carried across the yard. Clean, we are in the middle of a lot. Do you have a bid? I have a question first, Tate said. If that is all right. Heads turned. Not all of them. Maybe half. The other half were still looking at the tractor, or at their coffee cups, or at their own boots. But the ones who had turned kept looking. Go ahead, Hollis said. Has anyone read the service records? Tate said. He did not say it loudly. He said it the way Warren had taught him to say things in rooms full of men who did not yet know they should be listening. He said it the way you say a sentence you have rehearsed in private and are now speaking in public for the first time, which is to say, he said it clean, and he said it once, and he let it sit. There were no service records, said a voice from the crowd. It was Duane Pritchard. He was standing about 15 feet from the tractor arms, folded across his clipboard, and he was looking at Tate now. Really looking for the first time that morning, with the face of a man trying to recall whether he had seen this boy somewhere before, and deciding that he had not. No records were listed in the catalog, Duane said. No records were in the seat. I checked the seat myself at 7:40 this morning. Tate took a slow breath. You checked the seat, Tate said. You did not check behind the seat. The silence that came down on the yard after that sentence was not a polite silence. It was the kind of silence that happens in a room of 41 men when one of them has just heard something that could cost him money, and the rest of them realize in the same half-second that they are about to watch something they had not expected to watch on a Saturday morning in Celina. Hollis Thurston looked at Tate. Young man, Hollis said, "Do you have those records?" "Yes, sir," Tate said. Hollis considered this for a moment longer than an auctioneer usually considers anything. Then he said, "Bidding is paused. Come up here." Tate walked through the half-circle of men. He did not hurry. He had rehearsed this walk in his head the night before, standing at his bedroom window at 11 o'clock, looking out at the yard light on the barn, and the walk he had rehearsed was the walk of a boy who had done the work and who was not going to perform hamuma from anything. He was just going to put the information down on the table and let the room do what the room was going to do. He reached inside his jacket. He pulled out the freezer bag. He set it on the fender of the G705 flat, and he opened his spiral notebook to the page he had written the script on, and he did not look at the script. He had it memorized. The script was for calm, not for reading from. He looked out at the crowd. This tractor, Tate said, was owned for 11 years by a mechanic named Orville Bascomb, Wert County. Mr. Bascomb kept a service record on every machine he owned. This record begins March 11th, 1970. The final entry is March 22nd, 1980. 48 pages of documented maintenance. I will cite the 4 most important entries. He turned the first page of the freezer bag records. November 14th, 1974. Injector pump calibration at a certified Minneapolis Moline shop in Fort Wayne, Indiana. That service addresses the timing drift issue that affects every G705 past 1500 hours. At the time of service, this machine had 1,400 hours. The calibration has not drifted since because Mr. Bascomb adhered to the 800-hour service interval for the balance of his ownership. He turned another page. August 3rd, 1976. Hydraulic return line fitting replaced on the right side of the main valve block. The original fitting on a 63 model is the undersized pre-revision part. The replacement documented here with part number 1427-B is the post-65 revision. I verified the installed fitting at 7:30 this morning. The replacement is in place. That service closes out the hydraulic failure risk on this machine. He turned another page. April 19th, 1979. Front axle pivot bearing replaced. I examined the pivot this morning. The replacement part shows minimal wear, consistent with the hour count of 247 hours of operation since the service. He closed the record. Final entry, Tate said. March 22nd, 1980. Oil and filter change. 212 hours prior to the recorded total hours of 4,300. He set the record down on the fender of the tractor. A properly maintained Minneapolis Moline G705 diesel, Tate said, runs to 6,000 hours before requiring a major overhaul. This machine has 1,700 hours of service life remaining at normal operating rates. The 3 known weaknesses of the G705 have all been addressed on this specific machine and documented. This is not a parts tractor. The yard did not move. Tate did not look at Duane Pritchard. He did not look at Lester Mundy either. He looked at Hollis Thurston. "That is what I wanted to say," Tate said, before the gavel came down. Hollis Thurston had been calling auctions for 16 years. He had never once in 16 years paused a lot for a 17-year-old with a freezer bag of records. He did not know what to do with his face for a moment. Then he did what professionals do when they are uncertain. He fell back on the procedure. "All right," Hollis said. "New information on the machine. Bidders, you may examine the records. Bidding is suspended for 10 minutes. Duane Pritchard was already moving. He crossed the 15 feet of gravel between his position and the tractor in about 4 strides. He reached the fender. He picked up the freezer bag. He opened it. He pulled out the stack of records. He began to read. Tate took 1 step back from the fender and let him read. Duane Pritchard was a fast reader. He had not gotten to where he was in the farm equipment business by being slow with paper. He went through the first 10 pages at a steady clip, his eyes moving across the columns, his face showing nothing. At about the 15th page, he slowed down. By the 20th page, he was reading each entry individually. By the 30th page, he had stopped entirely and was just standing there with the stack in his hands, looking at one specific page. He was on the last page, the one Orville Bascomb had written by hand on March 22, 1980. Duane read it once, then he read it again. Then he looked up from the page and looked at Tate. Tate looked back at him. He did not say anything. He did not have to say anything. The page said it. Duane Pritchard had been in the farm equipment business in Western Ohio since 1961. He had known Orville Bascomb by reputation for 20 years. He had known Warren Shaw by reputation for 30. And the name Warren Shaw had meant to Duane Pritchard in the middle of the 1960s, a particular kind of older mechanic that Duane had regarded with the private contempt young men in the industry had for the old-timers they were replacing. A man too slow to keep up, a man who did not understand where the business was going, a man whose way of working was going to be obsolete inside a decade. Duane had said things about Warren Shaw at the Celina implement dealership lunch table in 1966 and 1967 and 1968 that he had not thought about in 15 years. He did not need to remember the exact words. He remembered the tone. He remembered the contempt. And now he was standing in his own home county auction yard at 11:34 on a Saturday morning in September of 1981, holding a handwritten note from a dead man that said in careful blue ink, "Tell Warren Shaw's grandson that his grandfather taught me everything I know about how to keep a machine running past the point where other men would quit." Duane Pritchard did not say anything for about 15 seconds. He did not apologize. That part matters, and it matters for a specific reason. Duane Pritchard was not a man who apologized in public for things he had done in private. He was not built for that. And Orville Bascomb had not written the note to produce an apology. And Warren Shaw had not spent 40 years learning his craft in order to be apologized to by a man who had sneered at him in 1967. What Duane Pritchard did instead was nod. Once. A small nod. To nobody in particular, but aimed slightly in Tate's direction. Then he folded the last page back into the stack, and he put the stack back in the freezer bag. And he set the freezer bag back down on the fender of the Minneapolis Moline G705. And he looked up at Hollis Thurston on the auctioneer's stand. "I am ready to bid," Duane said. Hollis looked across the yard to the rest of the bidders. Anybody else need more time? Lester Mundy, standing at the back of the crowd with his briefcase still against his leg, did not move. He was ready. He had been ready since 7 in the morning. Virgil Ames, the parts dealer from Lima, looked at the tractor one more time with a slightly different expression than he had looked at it with 2 minutes earlier, and then looked at his catalog sheet, and then shook his head. Virgil was out. Virgil's math was parts math, and parts math did not extend past $600, no matter what was behind the seat. The second bidder from earlier had already stepped back. He was out too. "All right," Hollis said. "Bidding reopens at $600. $700, Duane said. $800, Lester Mundy said from the back of the crowd. $900, Duane. $1,000, Lester. $1,100, Duane. Lester Mundy did not respond. He was still for about 3 seconds. Tate was watching him. Lester's face did not show much, but the hand that was holding the briefcase tightened slightly around the handle, and then relaxed, and then tightened again. And Tate understood, watching it happen, that Lester was running the math in his head one more time, and watching the profit margin that had brought him to Celina from Toledo at 5:30 in the morning shrink down to a number he could no longer justify, at $1,100 a G705. With 1,900 hours of remaining life, had a theoretical resale ceiling of roughly $2,200, which meant if Lester bought it at $1,100 and paid his transport and paid his broker fee and accepted the normal 2 to 3 month hold on a specialty piece, his margin was going to land somewhere around $700 on $1,100 invested, which was a 59% return, which was good money. At $1,200, the margin dropped to about $500, a 40% return, which was still acceptable. At $1,300, the margin dropped to $300, which was where the return crossed the line between speculation and labor. At $1,400, there was no margin left at all. Lester Mundy had driven 90 minutes in the dark that morning for a 59% return. He had not driven 90 minutes for a 40% return against a dealer with a bruised pride and a home county reputation to protect. He lifted his paddle one more time. $1,150, he said. He said it in a flat voice. He was making one more bid. He was not going to make a second one. Duane heard the flatness. $1,200, Duane said. Hollis waited. Hollis was good at his job. Hollis knew the sound of a bidder who was about to quit, and the sound of a bidder who was still in it. And he gave Lester exactly one beat before he began the count. Lester Mundy did not raise his paddle. $1,200 going once, Hollis said. Going twice. Sold to bidder number 14 for $1,200. The gavel came down. Lester Mundy lowered his paddle. He did not look at Tate. He did not look at Duane. He picked up his briefcase and walked back through the half-circle of men and out through the auction gate and across the gravel lot toward a beige sedan parked under the hackberry tree beside Merle Shaw's old pickup. He opened the driver's door. He set the briefcase on the passenger seat. He closed the door. He started the engine. He drove out of the lot onto the state highway and turned west toward Toledo. He never came back to a Mercer County auction. Tate learned years later that Lester Mundy worked the eastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania circuits after that fall and stayed out of the western counties entirely. He had decided in $1,200 of bidding that he was not going to come back to a yard where a 17-year-old boy could cost him $1,000 of margin in 20 minutes. That is what happened to Lester Mundy. What happened to Duane Pritchard happened slower and happened in two parts. The first part happened right there in the auction yard, about 90 seconds after the gavel came down. Duane walked the 12 feet from his position at the fender of the G705 to where Tate Shaw was standing, and he stopped in front of Tate, and he looked down at him, because Duane was about 4 inches taller, and he said directly without preamble, "I would like to offer you a job." Tate did not answer right away. $5 an hour, Duane said. Preview work. You come to the auctions I send you to. You look at the machines I tell you to look at. You report to me in writing before the sale opens. I use your information when I bid. Tate let the offer sit for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "No thank you, Mr. Pritchard." Duane Pritchard had been in the business for 20 years. He had made a lot of offers. He had not in 20 years had a 17-year-old decline a $5 an hour preview job with his dealership. While standing next to the tractor, the 17-year-old had just cost him an extra $600 on. His face did something complicated. Then it settled. What rate, Duane said. Tate had thought about this question for 6 weeks. He had written out in the back of his spiral notebook 17 different versions of the answer he would give if this moment came. He had rehearsed the final version 3 times in his bedroom, the night before standing in front of the mirror above his dresser, speaking the sentence out loud until it came out the way he needed it to come out. Which was to say, not the way a boy would say it, the way a man would. "I am not interested in preview work at an hourly rate," Tate said. "What I am offering is research. Research is different. Research is the documented, deep evaluation of a specific machine against its known weaknesses, cross-referenced with factory bulletins and service history. I will do that work for you on the machines I select. Not every machine. The machines I choose. My rate for that work is $30 an hour, with a minimum of 3 hours per machine." Duane looked at him. "You are 17 years old," Duane said. "Yes, sir," Tate said. "You want $30 an hour?" "Yes, sir." "And you pick the machines?" "Yes, sir." Duane was quiet for a long moment. The number Duane was running in his head, which Tate could not see, but could guess at, was this. Duane had just paid $1,200 for a machine he had valued in the morning at about $400 on a breakdown basis. The difference, $800, was the gap between what he had planned to pay and what he had actually paid. If Tate's research had made that gap instead of closing it, then Tate's research had cost Duane $800 of found money. If Tate's research had closed it, then Tate's research had saved Duane from buying a breakdown machine at $1,200, which would have been a catastrophic misjudgment. Tate's research had protected Duane's $1,200 investment by confirming that the machine was worth $2,000 plus. Either way, Tate's research in this single transaction had moved $1,200 of Duane's capital into a position that was worth $800 to $1,000 more than he had thought it was worth an hour earlier. $30 an hour for 3 hours was $90. $90 against $800 to $1,000 of value was a rate of return Duane had never paid anyone in his life and had also never been offered before. There was another factor. Tate did not say it and did not need to say it, but it was present in the air between them anyway. The factor was that Tate Shaw, standing in the yard at 11:38 in the morning on September 19th of 1981, was not a 17-year-old boy who was going to become a John Deere salesman. He was not going to become a parts counter clerk. He was not going to become an employee. He had just decided, in the form of a single professional counteroffer, that he was going to be his own man. And the dealer standing in front of him could either be the first client of that man's career on that man's terms, or he could be the dealer who had walked away from that man's career at the first offer and watched the man build it with somebody else. Duane Pritchard had not become the largest dealer in Western Ohio by misreading that kind of moment. "Done," Duane said. He put out his hand. Tate took it. They shook once. Duane's hand was twice the size of Tate's. The grip was steady and brief and had nothing personal in it. It was the grip of a professional agreement between two men, the same grip Duane would have used to close a deal with anyone his own age in the industry. And it was the first handshake of Tate Shaw's working life. "I will call you Monday," Duane said. "Yes, sir," Tate said. Duane turned and walked away across the yard to deal with the paperwork on the tractor. Tate stood by the fender of the Minneapolis Moline G705 for a moment longer with the freezer bag in his left hand and the spiral notebook in his right. And he looked at the grain of the fender paint under his fingers. And he felt for the first time all morning the full weight of what the last 3 hours had actually cost him and what they had actually earned him. And he carried it with him, because some weights you do not put down until years have passed, and the shape of the thing has changed in your memory from a cost to a piece of who you turned out to be. He walked out of the auction yard and back to his father's old pickup and drove home. He got back to the farm at 3:20 in the afternoon. His father was in the equipment shed changing the oil in the '68 Ford tractor that was now the only tractor they owned. His mother was on the front porch, snapping beans from the garden into a colander on her lap. Tate parked the pickup beside the barn and walked to the porch and sat down on the top step and handed his mother the freezer bag without a word, and he told her in about 5 minutes of quiet sentences what had happened at the Mercer County auction that morning. Adelaide Shaw listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she set the colander of beans aside, and she stood up and she walked into the kitchen. And about 30 seconds later, Tate heard her call out the window for his father to come up to the house. And when Merle came up from the shed with grease on his hands, Adelaide made him sit down at the kitchen table, and then she made Tate repeat the whole story from the beginning, and then she made Tate tell his father the number. $30 an hour, Tate said. Merle Shaw did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then he got up from the table and walked to the sink and washed his hands and dried them on the dish towel above the stove and walked back to the table and sat down again. and looked at his son, really looked at him, for the first time in 2 years. "How much of a job is this?" Merle said. "Mr. Pritchard calls me on Monday," Tate said. "I work his auctions through the winter, between Celina and 3 other dealers. I expect to pick up, I calculate, about 6 machines a month at 3 hours each. At $30, that is $540 a month. 6 months between now and March 15th. $3,200 if everything breaks even. $3,800 if I get 4 dealers. $4,200 if one of the dealers refers me to another one." Merle Shaw stared at his son. He did not speak. Adelaide put her hand on her husband's forearm and squeezed it once hard and let go. The story of what Tate did between September of '81 and March of '82 traveled in the way stories in farm country travel ahead of him. Duane Pritchard called on Monday as promised, and a second dealer in Adelaide County called on Wednesday because he had heard what had happened at Mercer from a cousin who ran the coffee urn at the September sale. And by the second week of October, Tate had 3 clients and was driving his father's pickup to auctions across 5 counties. The story reached the diner on Main Street in Rockford by the second week. By the end of October, it was being retold at the co-op over in Van Wert, where 2 retired farmers who had known Warren Shaw for 40 years listened to a younger man tell the version he had heard, and then looked at each other across the coffee cups and did not say anything, because some kinds of satisfaction are private to a generation and do not need to be explained to the next one. By Christmas, Tate had $1,100 in the brown envelope he kept in the bottom drawer of his bedroom dresser. By February 15th, he had $3,800. On March 11th, a 4th dealer in Henry County, who had heard about Tate from Duane Pritchard at a winter equipment show, called and asked for an emergency evaluation of an Oliver that was going to auction on the 23rd. Tate did the research in 1 day and billed the dealer $500. On March 13th of 1982, he walked into the Meridian Bank in Celina at 9:30 in the morning with a brown envelope that contained 43 $100 bills, and he set the envelope on the desk of the loan officer who had handled the Shaw account since 1976, and he paid the final balloon payment on the last note against his father's farm 2 days ahead of schedule. The loan officer counted the bills twice. Then he looked up at Tate. Then he stamped the note paid in full and handed the stamped copy back to Tate and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Tate drove home. Adelaide Shaw was at the kitchen table when he came through the back door, and she did not ask because she had known all morning, because Tate had called the bank the afternoon before to confirm the appointment. She stood up when he walked in. She did not say anything. She put both her hands on either side of his face, and she held them there for a long moment looking at her son. And then she pulled him forward and kissed him on the forehead, the way she had kissed him when he was 8 years old and homesick from school. And then she let him go, and she turned away to the sink so he would not see her cry. He walked down to the shed and told his father. Merle Shaw did not cry either. He did something else. He walked out of the shed and across the yard and out to the east fence line, where you could still see. 2 years later, the line where Meridian Bank had surveyed off the 80 acres. And he stood there for a long time, looking east. And then he turned around and walked back to the house and took his wife's hand at the kitchen table and said Adelaide, and did not say anything more. That was the whole sentence. That was the end of that chapter. In 1984, Tate Shaw bought back 40 of the 80 acres that had been foreclosed on in '79. He bought them from the speculator, who had bought them from the bank at a small premium over what the speculator had paid. And the speculator sold because Tate brought cash, and because the ground had not performed for the speculator the way the speculator had believed it would. The Shaw family returned to 200 acres that spring. Tate finished high school in June of 1982 and did not go to college. He worked full-time as an independent research consultant for farm equipment dealerships across 5 counties at the $30 hourly rate he had set with Duane Pritchard, which had by 1983 become the standard rate for that kind of work in Western Ohio, because Tate had defined the category by being the only person doing it. In 1990, at the age of 26, he opened Shaw Agricultural Consulting in Van Wert, Ohio, in a small office on the second floor of a building 2 blocks from the library, where he had filed his first interlibrary loan requests as a 16-year-old boy. His first employee was a 22-year-old mechanic from Delphos, who had taught himself to read service manuals the same way Orville Bascomb had learned from Warren Shaw in 1958. Warren Shaw died in April of 1993 at the age of 84. In his will, he left his entire documentation library, 43 years of service manuals and factory bulletins and hand-annotated catalogs to Tate, with a note folded into the first binder that said only you who already knew what to do with these. Tate moved the library to his office. He added to it 3 walls of a room that his 2 daughters grew up treating as their grandfather's room, although neither of them ever met Warren in person. In October of 2019, at a farm equipment auction in Allen County, Ohio, a 24-year-old woman named Merle Shaw, Tate's oldest daughter, spent 40 minutes at preview on a 1971 white 2135 tractor, while the rest of the yard spent 5 and moved on. A dealer who had been in the business for 30 years watched her work the whole time. When she was done, he walked over to her. "What did you find?" he said. She opened her notebook. The yard went quiet in the same way yards go quiet when a young person who has done the work begins to speak. It is never the loudest voice in the room that carries the most weight. It is the most prepared one. And preparation is the one inheritance that nobody, not the bank, not the weather, not the market, can ever take from you, because it lives in the time you spent when no one was watching. And if this story has stayed with you, if you have ever in your life done quiet work through a long season, while the people around you did not yet understand what you were building, then you already know why you came to hear it told. Stories worth remembering are stories worth telling again.